Hello and welcome to Itenov Healthcare Solutions webinar, NextGen Utilities, the best kept secret to making your life easier. My name is Chelsea Grover and I'm the Marketing Communications Coordinator for Itenov. And let me just say, I am super excited about the webinar today. But before we get into it, I want to take a moment to explain the process for today's presentation. First, I'd like to mention that this webinar will be recorded. We'll send out a copy of the slides and recording within the next week. Next, for those of you who aren't familiar with Itenov, I wanted to share a bit of who we are with you. We specialize specifically in next-gen healthcare, and we're passionate about providing solutions for our healthcare provider partners, which in turn help them to improve patient care, enhance the patient experience, and maintain financially healthy practice. To sum it up, we do everything next-gen. And we also have some add-on productivity solutions for next-gen, including ChartGuard and Refund Manager. Next, I wanted to mention an upcoming webinar will be on June 12th on who is Itenov. This one's a bit different from our usual educational webinars, as it is instead of presenting on a next-gen or industry topic, we're going to be presenting on who we, Itenov, as a company are. Specifically, we're going to talk about the services and products that we provide as a company. We decided on this topic because it turns out that even a lot of our customers aren't aware of the full range of things that we can do, so this seemed like a good opportunity to spread the word around. We'll send an invite out for that soon, so keep your eyes peeled. Okay, so back to today's webinar on next-gen utilities. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the floor up to questions from you. We'll answer all the questions at the end, but you can type them in the questions area of the webinar control panel whenever they occur to you. And finally, for audio clarity purposes, everyone's phone will remain muted throughout the entire webinar. If you experience audio issues, please use the chat box to let us know so we can resolve them. And again, questions may be entered in the questions box. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Lindsay Lanning is Manager of Client Development, and Lexi DeMarsh is Managing Consultant at Itenov. So Lindsay, the webinar is all yours. Feel free to get started when you're ready.
Great. Well, thank you, Chelsea, and welcome everyone to our webinar, NextGen Utilities, the best kept secrets to make your life easier. I'll start by asking a very basic question. It should be pretty easy. Are you looking for ways to improve your NextGen experience? The answer I would assume is yes, absolutely. Well, we also want to help make your NextGen experience the best it can be for your staff and providers. So in this webinar, we showcase the various NextGen utilities available to clients designed to automate various jobs and processes such as file maintenance configuration, certain PM workflows, faxing, and even patient engagement initiatives. As you can see, these serve a multitude of functions to help your practice run more smoothly. So I will ask again, do you have any outstanding encounters that need to have office visits generated? There's a utility for that. How about any aged patient encounters with no charges that need to be moved to history? There's a utility for that too. Do you participate in government reporting for either Title X, Indian Health Services, or UDS? There are reporting utilities for that too. I kind of feel like an auctioneer or a salesperson on one of those infomercials that come on after you've fallen asleep and left the TV on late at night. But you get the gist here. There are so many utilities that NextGen offers that can perform functions that will make your life easier. So during this presentation, we're going to provide an overview of these utilities showcasing real-life client applications and use cases that will make your NextGen experience more efficient for your practice. Now, before we get started, I wanted to take a step back and ask, what is a utility? And no, I do not mean the lovely utility bills we have to pay each month. So I actually went to Merriam-Webster.com and they defined a utility as something useful or designed for use, or a program or routine designed to perform or facilitate especially routine operations on a computer. I want to focus on the phrases something useful and perform or facilitate routine operations, because that is exactly what these NextGen utilities do. They take a process that a user can do by themselves and automates it or makes it more efficient or less burdensome in some way for the end user. Lexi, our other presenter today, who will be taking you through the majority of our slides. Yes, you can all take a deep breath. You don't have to listen to me for a full hour like usual. But Lexi has been consulting with some fairly large or even some smaller but very complex practices lately and came to our team so excited about these utilities she recently discovered and has been using for her clients because they have made the world of difference. So they really do make a difference and help with doing things in bulk, but I will let Lexi dive into that in just a few slides. So what NextGen has done is bundled their most popular utilities and services into what are called utility packs. These have monthly fees that allow access to these utilities, as well as the option for pack add-ons. If you have already purchased any of these utilities, you will no longer have to pay the maintenance for that product. All the fees are included in that monthly cost. And you can see from that screenshot from the Success community where you can learn more about each utility and the packs. But the goal with these, as stated by NextGen, is to actually gain efficiency, save time, and save resources by using these simplifying solutions. So a common theme we'll see throughout this presentation. Now, to get started, you would go to ncslive.com or open a case in the Success community if you need to purchase a license, since most utilities do require a license key. However, there are two freebies that do not, and they are the contract utility and the import wizard. So I would jot that down, or maybe put a star next to it in your notes, or flag that slide, that you can access both of those completely free. We will go quickly through the offerings so you know what's available, and then deep dive into each one explaining what it does and a real world example. So these utilities can be purchased individually or as bundles, which I mentioned before, but you can buy them one at a time versus these packs. So the available bundles are the utility pack, which contains all configuration, workflow, and financial utilities. Then you have that utility pack plus government reporting, which contains all the configuration, workflow, and financial utilities plus government reporting. And then lastly, you have that NextGen utility pack plus government reporting plus California, which contains everything I mentioned and the California specific reporting. So they just build on each other to include more and more. Now you might be wondering, well, what are the configuration utilities? Well, they include the mass update utility, the patient De-Identifier, master data copy utility, the practice comparison utility, patient portal theming package 1, and then the import wizard. The workflow utilities contain the interactive voice response utility, automated document sharing, which we knew as Express Engine, image conversion utility, the survey export utility, as well as the offline document generator template and the patient tracking report template. And then the financial utilities. These refer to the general ledger utility, the refund and contract utility, the unapplied advanced and pay a reassignment, as well as the transaction import utilities, close the door functionality, and then encounters without charges template. I do want to note here, the general ledger, close the door, and encounters without charges template utilities are actually considered applications when you're downloading them versus utilities. So instead of going to that NCS Live link, search for these in the Success community. That might trip you up. Also, you'll notice some of these utilities have the same icons. It seems NextGen just used that lovely blue and black X icon as a default whenever they didn't have anything special for it. So don't let that trip you up either. The second bundle or tier had all those utilities I listed, and then the government reporting utilities, which include the UDS Reporting Console for our FQHCs on the call, the prescription export utility, the Title 10 report for federal reporting for HHS, the Ryan White RSR extract utility for the Ryan White HIV/AIDS Program Services report, the National Data Warehouse utility, and then that IHS diabetic audit for any Indian Health Services organizations. So again, some really great add-ons here to make your quality reporting a little easier on some of you. We all know we have plenty to deal with under MIPS or maybe PCMH transformation. These can make your other reporting obligations a little less burdensome for you in your practice. And then lastly, we have the California reporting specific bundle, which includes the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development reports. We also have the Child Health and Disability Program Manager, and then the Comprehensive Perinatal Services Program as well. These were all California specific reports for clients in that state. So with all of those utilities listed, I am sure a couple, if not more, got your attention and piqued your interest, and you will learn more about what they can actually do. As I mentioned before, I will turn over to Lexi, who will take us through these utilities and how her and her clients are using them in the real world today, and even provide you some tricks I know she's picked up along the way with how to make these work even better for you that you can really only get when you're working with it and from that experience using these utilities. So without further delay, I will turn over to Lexi. So Lexi, it is all yours.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. So as we just reviewed, there are a lot of really good utilities that can really benefit any practice. So let's jump right into it. And let's start by reviewing some of the tools that are available. And then I'm going to give you some examples of how our clients have actually used these utilities in their practices. And they're able to save time and they make their lives so much easier. So first, we're going to take a look at those configuration utilities. So this group of utilities is geared towards the setup of a practice. So this is going to include things like file maintenance, practice preferences, and things in system admin. Okay, so the first utility we're going to look at is our mass update utility. So this utility is going to allow a user to quickly update several places within file maintenance and in the practice management application. So as you can imagine, these files, they can contain large amounts of data, such as maybe a large list of payers. And it can be very time consuming to have to update each individual record. So with a few clicks, a user can update thousands of records at a time using this utility. This tool gives the ability to filter data by enterprise and practice. So if there are any updates that are specific to either of those. And then with this utility, a practice can update all of the areas listed on your screen. So some examples are like the payer master file, the SIM library, and items in scheduling administrator. I want to mention a few things about this utility that you should keep in mind. So the first is that if there are any existing records that are selected to be updated, the missing records will be added, and then any existing records will be updated. It's important to note, however, that no records will be deleted. So this is just to ensure that no data is accidentally, erased during this process. The second thing that you should keep in mind is that while this data is being synchronized, the existing records, the data tables will be locked. So basically that means that if you're updating, for instance, like the practice tab of the payer master file, then that master file will be unable to be accessed by anyone trying to go and file maintenance. So NextGen recommends that you synchronize this data after hours. Okay, so here's an example of one of the functions of this tool. So using this payer practice feature, the practice has the ability to make mass updates to that practice tab of the payer master file. And you can do this for several payers at once. So you can come in here and select multiple payers and then even multiple practices to update at one time. So you can see at the top of the screenshot that there are tabs for each of those sub-tabs within that payer master file. So updates can be made to things like claims, transactions, and libraries. So in this example, you can see that the options that are available to update for that HCFA claims tab. So let's say I wanted to make an update here. I would select my information from the drop-down menus. Then I would select any applicable payers and practices that these changes apply to. And then in the bottom right there, I would click Update, and all those changes will be made real time. So now let's take a look at some of the ways that we have seen our clients actually use this mass update utility. So the first example comes from a client that has a large number of providers, and they have over 40 SIM exceptions per location that need to be added to each provider by location. So when this practice came to us and said that they needed to add a new SIM exception, it amounted to over 3,000 line items that need to be created. So this would have taken multiple people several days, and it probably would have resulted in errors. So instead, we recommended they use the mass update utility and they were able to add that new SIM exception to each provider and to each location in just a matter of minutes. The next example, this involves a practice that they decided to reevaluate their adjustment and transaction codes. So they kind of wanted to better track their payments and have those transaction codes more accurately reflect the payment source. So the problem with this, as you can imagine, is that they need to manually update each payer once they've created those new transaction codes. So they used this mass update utility, and they were able to quickly update each of those payer master files. So the next configuration utility that we're going to take a look at is called the Practice Comparison Utility. So this tool is going to give the user the ability to compare two practices, and then they can determine the similarities and differences in areas such as the practice preferences. We can look at security settings and universal preferences. So this can be really beneficial, if you have a group and you have multiple practices. So this utility, not only can it compare them, but it can also be used to sync one practice to another. For instance, you can copy the practice preferences of a new practice that you've just created with an existing one. And a practice can also export an Excel file of all of the current practices so they can keep that on file. So you can see in this screenshot that we have an example of the ability to compare the security settings between two practices. So you have the ability to compare the security right settings, all security groups, and then also those users that are assigned to those groups. So you can see that there is a column for each practice, and then any differences between the two are going to be highlighted in red. In the bottom left, we have our export button, and that can be clicked to generate an Excel report of these findings. And then, as I mentioned, if the target practice needs to be updated to match, let's say, the source practice, then in the middle there you have that synchronize button, and that can be used to quickly make those updates. So this utility can also be used to compare practice preferences. So just like with those security settings that we just saw, there will be two columns, and that's going to show the practice preferences for each practice. Any differences between the two will be displayed in red. And then something to note is if there's a preference that's in the form of a checkbox, that data is going to appear as a Y or an N. So a Y means that that box is checked in that practice, and an N means it's not. You also have the ability with these practice preferences to generate that Excel spreadsheet of those practice preferences. And then the practice preferences can be copied from one practice to another by clicking that synchronize button. And then lastly, as I mentioned, this tool can be used to compare universal preferences. So once again, there's going to be two columns, and that's going to compare the universal preferences between each practice. Then any data in red is going to indicate a difference between the two. So this data can also be exported to an Excel spreadsheet and synchronized just like the other preferences we've discussed. So as I mentioned, from any of those preference reports, you have the ability to copy selected data from one practice to another. So a user has the ability to select either just a single row to copy, or you can select multiple rows. So something to note is during the sync process, those data tables will be locked. So for instance, practice preferences. So NextGen recommends this is done after hours. And it's also important to keep in mind that when you are synchronizing that data, that any existing data will be updated and any missing data will be added, but no data will be deleted. So one way that we've seen our client use this practice comparison utility is we had a practice that was in the process of adding a new practice to their group. And they wanted to kind of simplify the process of updating those practice preferences and security group for that new practice. So instead of having to switch back and forth, between the two practices or take a bunch of screenshots and try to pull them up, they actually just use this practice comparison utility, and they were able to synchronize the data from that existing practice to the new one. So this not only saved them time, but they also avoided any errors from manually having to replicate that existing practice. So another great configuration utility is the import wizard. So this was previously referred to as the Go Live wizard. So if you're familiar with that term, this is the same thing. And I think the name change was appropriate because this tool can be used well beyond the initial Go Live of a practice. So this import wizard is going to allow practices to load data into their NextGen databases using Excel spreadsheets. So this data can be entered into a blank template that's generated from within the tool, or this information can even be exported from an external system. This utility can be used to update master files, libraries, and system administrator items, such as adding a list of new users into the system. So the first tab that opens when you launch the utility is the status tab, as you can see in the screenshot. So this tab is going to allow users to view past uploads. So you can see it'll give you information such as the date and time of an upload, which file or library was updated, and the user that performed the update. So if this data isn't being imported from an external system, your first step in using the import wizard is going to be to generate a blank template for the specific set of data that's going to be updated. So for instance, like providers. So once you've selected the appropriate tab on the left-hand side, you can click the Create New button, and that's going to generate a blank Excel spreadsheet for you to enter your data. So this template does need to be filled out according to NextGen specifications, and that's to make sure that you don't run into any issues during the import process. So don't worry if you're unsure. There are tips on how each column should be completed, and you can actually see that by hovering over the red triangle that's in the top right corner of most columns. And also each field is pre-formatted to ensure that the data appears appropriately in the system. So for example, if you're entering a last name, that's automatically going to be capitalized for you. So once we've completed that template that we generated, the next step would be to import that file into the wizard. So to select our newly created template, we'll want to click Browse, and then we're going to locate that file in the folder we saved it in. And then to upload that file, we click Load. So an important piece that most users forget when they're using this utility is to close the Excel spreadsheet that you just created before attempting to load it into the system. But don't worry, if you forget to close the template, like I do, I feel like 90% of the time, the utility will prompt you with an error message, and then you can just go ahead and close it and continue with your import. So along with that error message I just mentioned for forgetting to close out of the file, there are several other errors and warnings that you may encounter during the import process. So if the wizard encounters any of these errors, you will receive a dialog box that will give you some more information. And depending on the severity, you may be able to continue on, or it might require you to quit and make changes to your template. So if you are required to quit out of the dialog box, you can generate what they call a fix report, and that will basically give you a reference of what needs to be changed. So you can see here in our graphic that there are 4 types of errors that you might encounter. So the first one, it's not truly an error, it's our info icon. That basically just gives you a status of the import process as it goes along, so you can kind of see how far along you are. The next icon is that yellow triangle. That indicates a warning. So a warning is there's something abnormal about the data, but the import process can still continue. The next is the red X, and that's a true error. So this error needs to be addressed before the process can continue. So a common example that I've seen is that if you don't fill out a required piece of the template, you might receive an error. And then the last and the most dreaded is the red exclamation point, and that is a fatal error. So this is a file system error or maybe an unhandled exception error. So if you receive this, the import process cannot continue. The most common cause I've seen for this error is if you're accidentally uploading a template for the wrong data type. So let's say, for instance, you have a provider template, but you accidentally choose users, then you'll receive that error. So as you can imagine, there are so many ways that you can use this utility that would be a huge time saver. So one of the ways that a client of ours put this tool to use was when they had to import over 200 new referring providers for a new location that was joining their practice. So you can imagine adding over 200 new items to that provider master file would have taken hours and could have easily led to typos and other errors. So instead, the practice used this import wizard. They compiled all the required information into the template was uploaded, and those new referring providers were added in under an hour. So as you've just seen, there's numerous ways that these utilities can help when we're adding or updating large amounts of data into NextGen. But the functionality of these utilities doesn't stop at just data. They can also be used to help practices' everyday workflow. So one of the first workflow utilities that we're going to take a look at is the patient tracking report template. So this template allows practices to review those patient tracking intervals and the total time spent in the office. So from that data, a report can be generated, and that can be exported for further analyzing. So if your practice uses that patient tracking feature in EHR, you spend all that time training your staff and ensuring that they're following the patient accurately throughout the visit. So now you have a way to easily view that data. So this template is accessed a little differently from the other utilities I've mentioned so far. This is actually accessed from the System Practice template menu in the EHR. And when working with data generated by this template, you have a few options. You can filter by appointment date range, the rendering provider, and the location name. So in order to view the patient tracking data in a way that's helpful for your practice, there's a few filters that we just talked about. So I mentioned on the last slide, you can see in this screenshot, we can filter by appointment start date, end date, the provider, and the location. So once all of those necessary filters are entered, you would click Submit, and then the data is going to display on the grid of the template. So you can see there are columns for things such as the provider, the patient's name. It breaks out each step that is tracked for your practice into separate columns. And from this screen, a report can be generated, and that can help you review the data, and then that can even be exported to Excel. So probably the most common use that I've seen for this template would be the way one of our clients used it. So they wanted to cut down on wait times for their patients, and they needed a way to compile this data easily. So they wanted to evaluate, how long are patients at different stages in the appointment, and then they used that data to help identify any bottlenecks in the process. So using this template, they created a report, and it showed them separately how long the patient, was in the waiting room, how long they were waiting for the clinician, the time they actually spent with the provider in that room. And then they were able to use this data, and they could kind of reevaluate their processes. So another great tool for improving workflow is the offline document generator template. So what this template allows you to do is you can identify both billable and non-billable encounters that do not have a document generated. So this can be used if you're looking for a specific document type, or you're just looking to see if any documents in general have been generated. So from the template, you can generate a report. It's going to allow you to review all those returned encounters from your search. And then you can even generate specific documents all from within the utility. So like that patient tracking report template, this tool is accessed from the system practice template menu within the EHR. So that a user does have the ability to filter by things like the encounter date range, specialty, provider name, visit type, and then even any current generated templates. So your first step is going to be to find that specific set of encounters that you're looking for with this report. So you can see those filters I just mentioned, but in addition, you can also filter with criteria like the date and visit type. The encounters can be filtered by billable only. And then if you're looking for encounters, with or without a template. So once all that filtering criteria is entered, you can click Submit to generate your list. And then from that list of applicable encounters, a chart of a specific patient can be viewed by selecting that Open Patient button. You can also generate a report to view the encounters by selecting that Generate Report button. And then from there, you can export that report to Excel if needed. So after reviewing that report, if any of those documents are determined to be needed for those specific encounters, they can actually be generated directly from within this template. So basically, a user would select either just individual patients, or you can choose the entire list of results. And then you can select the document that needs to be generated. So any requested documents, they are going to be sent to that offline document processor to be generated. So something to keep in mind, if you're compiling a large list of encounters at one time, only the top 1,000 encounters are going to be sent to that offline document processor at one time. So this is just so we don't overwhelm your system. But if necessary, a user can check that after hours processing checkbox, and that's going to remove that top 1,000 encounters restriction and send all of those documents to be generated at one time. As you can imagine, if you have thousands of documents trying to be generated at once, this can impact system performance. So we really recommend you only check that box if it truly is after hours. So we had a client, and they wanted to determine the percentage of encounters that were missing a specific master document. So generating this document was part of their workflow, but it was sometimes missed. So they used this template to narrow down the providers and the visit types where this document was missing most often. So they were able to not only generate that document that was missing for those encounters, but then they also created a report. And this helped them to understand, who needed maybe some more education, and then also what processes, if any, needed updated. All right, so now that we have looked at a few examples of utilities that can help with system configuration and then also can improve your practice's workflow, we're going to explore some of the ways utilities can be used to improve a critical part of any practice, the money. So the first financial utility we're going to look at is the contract utility. So I'm sure as anyone who is part of the revenue side of a practice is aware, contracts are so crucial to prevent denials and ensure that reimbursement comes faster. So this tool is going to allow a user to create new contracts and update existing ones through Excel spreadsheets. These spreadsheets are then uploaded through the utility. So a few things you can do with this utility. You can import and export contracts, and that's going to allow you to make changes. You can globally update the allowed amounts. So it can be done by either percentage or a specific dollar amount. A user can link or unlink payers and providers to contracts. You can also link contract exceptions to providers as needed. And then finally, a user can globally update those line item expiration dates. So the first step to updating contracts through the utility is to export a contract template. So this can be an existing contract, so if there are modifications that need to be made, or this can be a blank contract template if this is a brand new contract. So if exporting an existing contract, you can use certain filters. That way you're only exporting the data that's necessary. So some examples of these filters are only by active items or a CPT code range. So within this contract template, a user can add and modify those contract defaults. They can update fee schedules. They can update modifiers and any of those contract exceptions. So once you've exported the appropriate contract template you need, your new contract information can be added. So if you're using an existing contract, those contract defaults and any of the current fee schedules, those will be populated, and then they can be manipulated as needed. So for the two main tabs of the template that we use for upload, there are some required fields. And they aren't in red or anything, so it can be a little confusing. So for our first tab, which is those contract defaults, our required fields are the contract name and the effective and the expiration date. So as I mentioned, if this is an existing contract, information like the contract name and things like that would be filled in for you. On our second tab, which is for our fee schedules, those required fields are going to be the effective date for all fees and the expiration date for all fees. So without all of these required fields completed, you are going to get an error if you try to import that template. So once we've completed our template and we're good to go, we can import it into the utility. So it's important to keep in mind when creating these templates that all of the CPT codes must exist in that CPT4 code table, and then any adjustment transaction codes must exist in the transaction codes master file. I know this sounds a little bit obvious, but we did run into an issue with a client where some of their SIM codes were all pointing to the same CPT code in the CPT4 code table. So this was causing some issues when they were trying to upload a new contract. So when you're importing that existing contract, there's a few options of how that data will upload. So the first is to create an entirely new contract with a different name. So if you need to keep that existing contract intact, you can replace the current contract completely with your new template. And then finally, you can update the existing contract just with the changes. So it's important to remember that just like we talked about with the import wizard, this template cannot be opened while you're trying to import it into the utility. If it is open, you'll receive an error message. So another feature of this contract utility is the ability to globally update items in the contract, such as the allowed amounts. So these amounts can be adjusted by percent or dollar amount. And the group of which CPT codes are going to be affected by those updates can be filtered. So you can do that by specific CPT code range. You can look at effective and expiration dates. So you might be thinking this feature is pretty similar to the contract global update option. So that's located in file maintenance. So if I went in my contract library and right-clicked, but the main difference between this and the option that you have in file maintenance is that in file maintenance, it's going to use your RVU and GPCI libraries, and that's how it's going to update those new allowed amounts. So this utility is specifically updating by a percent or a dollar amount. So a common use for this utility that we have seen is that a practice receives updated fee schedules from a payer. So they need to go in and make those required changes. So instead of going into the contract and having to manually update, the effective and expiration dates, the allowed amounts for each individual CPT code, a practice can use this tool to quickly make those changes. So in this scenario, the practice I'm referencing, they downloaded their existing contract, they made all those changes as outlined by the payer, and then they uploaded that template, and they were able to ensure that the appropriate reimbursement is quickly done with minimal effort. So the next utility we're going to take a look at addresses an issue that some practices really struggle with. So it's commonplace to collect money from the patient before services, such as copays or deposits. But it can be a hassle to make sure that that money is appropriately and efficiently handled after the services are provided. So this tool is going to automatically apply encounter or account unapplied transactions to any of those outstanding patient balances. So the way it does this is by creating a batch of those now applied transactions. Then that batch can be reviewed by a user before posting, just to make sure the money was applied correctly. So this utility is designed to run every night, but it also has the ability to be run on demand if that's needed. So it's important to note that this tool is going to exclude any encounters or accounts that have unposted transactions. So this is just to avoid applying money to an encounter or an account prematurely. So before you can use this unapplied advanced utility, the different functions have to be configured. So this is just to ensure that the tool is working the best way it can for your specific practice. Something to note, if you do have multiple practices within a group, these functions are configured for each practice separately. So you can see on the slide the example of this other menu items dropdown. So if I select that dropdown, I can go in and change the practice that I'm creating the functions for while staying in the utility. So a few examples of some of the functions that you can work with. The first is the account unapplied. So that's going to apply any account unapplied credits to any encounters for the guarantor. The encounter unapplied, that's going to apply any of those encounter unapplied credits to any encounters that have a patient balance. And finally, there's the encounter to account unapplied, and that's going to transfer any encounter unapplied credits to the account as now an account unapplied. So those are just a few examples of functions you can use. So on this screen, you can see an example of one of the configurations. This is for the account unapplied function. So you can see some of the items that you can customize are the transaction codes that are going to be used in that batch. You can set up the minimum and maximum encounter age and a few other filters. Something to note, if your practice is going to plan on using the BBP to post the unapplied batches that are created from this tool, you want to make sure to check off that include in schedule checkbox in this window. So if your practice plans to use this utility with the scheduler, so it's typically the BBP, the order of the function needs to be defined. So that's that second icon there, and this is going to tell the system, how to run through those functions that you set up. So I mentioned on the last slide, in order for these functions to be able to be scheduled, it's important that that include in schedule is checked on that configuration window. And just keep in mind, when you're setting your practice's schedule, NextGen recommends that the encounter unapplied feature is ran before the account unapplied if you plan on using both. So after your practice has been using this utility for a while, you can now go in and review the history of the tool with that history icon. So each row in this history tab is going to be a different batch. So I can click on any of those rows, and that's going to allow me to see the individual line items within that batch. This filter can be, or this history can be filtered by date range, and then even by specific function. From within this history screen, you can also manually execute any function as needed. So to do this, I would select that lightning bolt icon in the top right, and just keep in mind that all functions are going to run that you've set up when using this lightning bolt feature, unless you have these history results filtered by a specific function. So the best client example that comes to mind for me for this utility is a client that collects large amounts of deposits. So these are for the procedures that they perform, and they actually collect these during that initial visit. But the procedure doesn't typically take place for a few weeks or even months later. So they're running into a lot of difficulties being able to reconcile these unapplied amounts and ensure that they, that money just wasn't lost in space. So this practice regularly uses this tool, and they can apply those account unapplied credits that were created during that initial visit, and those get applied to the guarantor's encounters that have patient balances. So this has greatly reduced the amount of staff time taking to apply these amounts, and it's helped tremendously with their AR. So another financial utility that can be beneficial when you're trying to kind of clean up patient charts is the close the door utility. So as the name kind of implies, this is going to help you with the process of closing the door on encounters by moving any of those aged patient encounters without any charges to history status. So this is accomplished by a scheduled SQL script that's going to automate this process. So basically, this is just eliminating, the need to manually add those dummy charges and void them in order to move those encounters to history status. So we have encountered several practices that have large number of encounters that have no charges. So therefore, they're never moved, and they're going to stay in that history status forever. So, instead of embarking on a whole manual cleanup process that would have taken time and resources, they used this tool. So they were able to quickly clean up the encounters, and it took minimal effort. So the last financial utility that we're going to take a look at is the Encounters Without Charges template. So this template is going to allow practices to locate encounters that have not been finalized, and therefore they have no charges submitted. So this template is going to create a list of all the applicable encounters, and they can be filtered so you can exclude certain visit types and SIM codes that wouldn't apply. So for each encounter, the practice can view to see which templates were used, any documents that have been generated, and then any charges that were submitted. So for one of our clients, they came to us because they were having an issue with providers not completing their documentation and finalizing visits. So they wanted an easy way to track these encounters that haven't been finalized yet. So using this tool, the practice can now regularly create a report of all visits where documentation has not been completed. They then share this information with their providers via this report, and then the providers can complete their documentation and then enter any charges.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Lexi, for all of your wonderful explanations and expertise and real-world examples. It definitely helped kind of dissect the information and really understand the functions here. And although we are not in person right now, I'm sure we have some excited attendees on the line right now, just jumping up and down in their computer chairs. And if you haven't found a utility that maybe has sparked joy for you, as my friend Marie Kondo would say, we have one last shot with government reporting utilities. And if you are like me, these will be some of your favorite ones. So first up is the UDS Reporting Console. So each year, health center grantees and lookalikes report on their performance using the measures defined in that uniform data set. These measures can include things like the number and sociodemographic characteristics of the people they serve. Think of types and quantities of services they provide, even counts of staff who provide these services, really any information about the quality of care provided, as well as the cost and efficiency data relative to the delivery of those services, and then even the sources and amounts of health center income. So this is all collected and used to not only comply with legislative and regulatory requirements, but also keep the HRSA and Congress informed on performance and operations. It's also used to document program effectiveness and, as always, identify trends over time and actually enable comparison with national benchmarks and other health centers. So long story short here, health centers must submit 12 tables in the universal report. And the UDS Reporting Console covers a lot of items in these various tables that are contained within the NextGen application, making life a lot easier for those of you who have to submit this data. So you can see in the screenshot from the user guide all the items this tool covers for submission, and it's actually broken down by those tables for you. And as you can see, there are a lot. So users can view report results in the console or export results and generate reports on demographic, clinical, and financial data as outlined by UDS. You just need to make sure before running any reports you correctly map. So to configure the console, you must set qualifying encounter flags in the SIM library for any applicable procedure codes. This is going to flag the visit for reporting in the console if at least one of the SIM codes has that flag set associated with it. Now, a user can override that flag manually if they need to on the Claims tab in the Encounter Maintenance for any individual encounter if you need to. And then, as I mentioned before, you also need to map any custom PM and file maintenance values to UDS codes using the code mapping button that we outlined in red there. You do have the ability to actually create report filters. So users can actually create up to 5 report filters, and that's going to be based on practices, location, providers, and then exclusions. So you can then select a folder where reports should be exported, and you can even designate recipients to receive an email confirmation when the report is generated. So if you have one person who's responsible for this, that could be extremely helpful, or if you have multiple, they can get an email letting them know that this is completed and that it's generated. Now, to actually run the reports, you need to actually view the data. You have 2 options here, either automatically, where reports are actually set to automatically run every Saturday for any of the filters that you have marked active, and then the results can be viewed in the results dashboard, or on demand. So these are called ad hoc reports, and they can be run at any time by selecting the ad hoc button from that results dashboard. Now, the real world example, or the real world application here, is pretty obvious for practices who do participate in UDS reporting. You all wanted a more efficient way to generate the required data for UDS reporting to replace that manual configuration and manual generating of reports by that practice manager. So now practices can use the console to configure the required reports and set them to automatically generate each week. So manual intervention is not needed, which, as we all know, saves time and resources to focus on other value add activities or maybe other quality reporting initiatives, like, for instance, running MIPS reports in the HQM like me. And then finally, we have the Title X report. So annual submission for the Family Planning Annual Report is required for all Title X Family Planning Services grantees for purposes of monitoring and reporting program performance. So this data is presented in summary form, which protects the confidentiality of individuals who receive Title X funded services. So this utility generates that report and compiles all the necessary data into one place or report to submit. Users do have the option to configure multiple reports based on filters, such as by practice, if you would like as well. Again, just some lessons learned here from experience. You really do need to configure the console by mapping any custom PM and file maintenance values to UDS codes. We keep saying it and stressing it because we constantly run into issues, and this is usually the solution. Once mapping status is 100% completed, you can run reports and create report filters, again, by enterprise, practice, location, and exclusions. If you are filtering by exclusions, you can exclude results by CPT code ranges, providers, and persons. So in this case, obviously, we don't want any patient-specific information, so we're referring to test patients. Again, when running these reports, it's very similar to the UDS reports. You have the option to run them automatically or on demand. If you choose automatically, you can use the SQL Server agent to schedule the report. The SQL job can actually be set up by selecting the Create SQL Job button. Or if you want to run them on demand, you can select Run New Report under the desired filter, or Run Now to use the last used filter. Just note another pro tip here from experience: any changes made to any mappings or filter settings while a report is being run will cause an error. And for our real world application here, again, it's very similar to UDS and, in my opinion, pretty reasonable. Practices just wanted an easy way to fulfill this reporting requirement without manual setup or kickoff each time they needed it, which this utility does. Oh, so as you can see, I think we delivered on our promise here to try and give you all the information possible on how to make your NextGen experience work a little better for you and work more efficiently for you in your practice. As always, if you're uncertain where your practice stands, let iTenif help. We can help you through a variety of ways. We can provide recommendations to assess your current practice state and also help implement new processes or procedures, including these utilities. If you're interested at all or want to learn more about us, please visit us at iTenif.com. Definitely continue to sign up for our informative webinars and blogs. We have a lot of great content coming over the next few weeks and months for you all. And of course, consider our 3-day fixed price on-site consultations for clinical workflow, revenue cycle and front office, as well as technology and performance. These especially are great ways for us to identify utilities that could benefit your practice and our recommendations to your practice at the end of this on-site evaluation. And of course, test drive our products. Well, we have made it to questions. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chelsea for any questions those of you on the call may have, and hopefully Lexi and I can do our best to answer them. I will preface saying if there are very specific practice-specific questions, a lot of these depend on your current setup as well as your current version and practice preferences, so we may need to chat offline, but if you think it can apply to everyone or you have some more broad range questions on how these work, please don't hesitate, ask away. So Chelsea, is all yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Lexi, and thank you, everyone, for joining us again. Again, if you have questions, you can type them in the questions area of the webinar control panel. Looks like we only have a handful, and we'll stay on to get through those. So if you have them, feel free to shoot them out there as well, and we'll just go in the order that we received them. I did get a bunch of questions asking if we'll be sending out a copy of the presentation. Absolutely. I'll be sending that out within the next week, probably sooner. And so that'll be an email with a link to the recording along with the slide deck. Occasionally that ends up in spam boxes, so if you don't get it, check there. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me or to Lindsay or Lexi, and we'll be happy to get them to you as well a different way. So first question, can we use this utility to generate telephone call documents? That was
yes, so
at the very beginning-ish, about a half hour in.
Okay, so I'm assuming if you're talking about the offline document generator, and yes, it can be used to generate any document. Doesn't just have to be master documents.
Awesome, thank you, Lexi. Next question, can the offline document generator template be used for locked encounters?
Yes, so you should have no problem with that.
Great. Wow, we're going through these fast. Next question. I noticed that the government reporting utility was included in the utility pack, but can we just get that separately?
I can grab that one if you want. Kind of just the housekeeping here. Yes, you can. So NextGen does have the utility packs for you at your convenience to get kind of everything bundled into one, but they did specify, and it's on the Success community as well as that NCS Live website, that you can purchase these individually based on what your practice needs.
Perfect. Thank you, Lindsay. And it looks like this might be our last question, but if you have them or if you're in the middle of typing, we'll still answer more. You mentioned for the practice comparison utility that you can copy user groups from one group to another. Will that also copy the users listed in the group?
Yeah, I can take this one. So it will copy the users if they already exist in the database of the practice you're copying them to. So if they don't, they will not be copied.
Okay, well, thank you, Lexi and Lindsay. Thank you for putting this together. And everyone, again, thank you so much for joining us today. As a reminder, if you have follow-up questions, you can reach out to either Lexi or Lindsay, or you can always reply back to the email that I'll send out with the slides and the recording as well. So you got plenty of ways to get a hold of us. We're happy to help. Just let us know what we can help you with.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.